So I'm delighted to be talking to Jon Mills, who's an author, collector, and military historian. So John, tell me something about yourself and your books.
How long have you got? Um, I've always been interested in collecting. I started off with stamps, postcards, matchbox labels, all sorts of things like that. And about the age of 11, I got interested in military badges. I started to collect them, and then I discovered that I needed to know more about them. I've always been a bit interested in digging further, and I thought I'd not start to read books. And then I got to the stage in my late 20s when I thought, the trouble is, the books I want to read haven't been written yet. So I started to do research at places like the National Archives in Kew, and based on what I found there, I started to put together some books. The first of which was my book about the civil defence insignia, which is a topic that's quite popular with home front historians, but has never been properly covered in a book.
Right.
So that was the first one, which I published myself, and then I started to produce other ones, and then I met Ian, and he's produced a couple of my books for me.
So it was the collecting came first.
The collecting came first, absolutely, yes. But as I said, I wanted to know more and more about the things I've got. I'm not one of these people who's just a tick list collector.
Right.
I like to know what I'm looking at. And as I collected more and more, it became more and more interesting to discover what was behind these things, rather than just being emblems. They represented, in the case of things like home front badges, a lot of service by organisations that in many cases didn't exist before the Second World War, so had to be formed specifically for the Second World War. And many of them, of course, with the possible notable exception of the WRVS, didn't last any time after the Second World War. So.
Right. And so are you still collecting?
I don't collect as much as I used to, partly because I've now retired, so I don't have as much money as I had, and I'm running out of space.
Right. And of course, it's I guess collecting's over the years must have got a lot more expensive.
It has indeed. When I was buying home front Second World War bits in the early 70s, they were literally in junk shops.
Right.
Nowadays they are much sought after, there are many more collectors. In the case of home front lapel badges, of course, there are many more collectors because some idiot wrote a book about them, which people use as a collector's guide.
Right. We'll come on to your books in a little bit. How many books have you written? Do you know?
About 12.
12.
Yes.
Okay. And the civil defence was your first one.
Civil defence was my first one. I then did one on the Home Guard, which people would like to get hold of, but is now sadly out of print. I must discuss it with my publisher and see if he's interested in doing a reprint. Then I started a series called Within the Island Fortress, which was aiming to look at all the civil defence organisations or home front organisations in detail. I produced 4 of those, but I discovered that they weren't selling. And I then came up with another project, which if I want me to bore you, I will tell you all about later. But I've also done a couple. When I worked originally as a librarian in Wandsworth, and just before the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, they asked me to write a book, which I co-authored with the local history librarian. And I subsequently also wrote another book with a chap called Pat Luby, which was a photographic guide to Wandsworth at war. So that's 2 books on Wandsworth, which was where I was born and brought up and went to school.
Do you have a favourite book?
I have to say, and this is no reflection of the fact it's just you sitting in front of me, but Doing Their Bit is my favourite book.
Oh, excellent.
Because it's an area that isn't covered by anybody else, and is a fascinating area. I'm just fascinated with the idea that in a period when everybody was trying to save materials, somebody came up with the idea of issuing metal badges to all the people who were doing wartime service. It's particularly appropriate when you look at the fact that the salvage stewards, who were supposed to be saving resources, actually had their own badges made out of scarce materials.
How did you said you started collecting originally? Was there anything particular that drew you to the Second World War as an area of collecting?
A couple of reasons. The first one we've touched on, the Second World War stuff was cheap. Military badges have always been a bit expensive. But it really started when I looked at my own family's history. Whilst rummaging around about the age of 10 in my grandmother's garden shed, I found a steel helmet, a black one with a W painted on it, and I discovered that my grandfather had been an air raid warden in Wandsworth during the war. I then spoke to my mum and dad about their wartime experiences. My dad had been in the Home Guard in Wandsworth, and my mum had issued ration books and identity cards. But what fascinated more was that whereas people nowadays go to the battlefields of France, I was aware from looking at the things I was looking at that the evidence of the Second World War was all around me in the streets of London. In those days you could see air raid shelters, you could see signs painted on the walls, and I became more and more interested in that, and it grew from there really.
We've spoken about doing their bit, and we had a copy here.
Available from a very good source.
Absolutely. What do you particularly like about the book?
Well, apart from the fact it's beautifully presented, what I was encouraged to do was that during the research for the book originally, I discovered that a large number of the badges were made by a company called Thomas Fattorini in Birmingham. At the time, my wife worked for the Goldsmiths Company, who are related to whose responsibilities include jewellers, and I met one of the Fattorini family. And he said, "Oh, I can put you in touch with my cousin, Tom Fattorini, who's in Birmingham, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to talk to you." I then arranged through another friend to go to Fattorini's in Birmingham. They're still in the same building that they've made all these badges in during the Second World War. And I said to them, "Do you keep any records?" And they said, "No, we don't have an archive." But the man produced a bag and said, "Here's 100 badges which I've collected over the years. If you'd like to take them away and photograph them, you can do so."
Oh, fantastic.
I also discovered through a journal called the Badge Collectors Quarterly, which I'm not sure whether it still exists, that somebody had done some research on the advertising literature. So I was able to include at the front of this book a lot about the people who actually made the badges, which I found more interesting than just looking at the badges, or equally interesting as looking at the badges.
Right. And so this one's colour throughout, isn't it? There's pictures of the Fattorini advertising in there
Yes,
as well.
we've got some Fattorini adverts in here. I'm sure we can find them if we try hard. That one, for example, Fattorini advert for ARP lapel badges, showing the sorts of things. And what is fascinating is that I stopped collecting these home front badges quite a long time ago, but I still monitor eBay to look for them as they turn up. And they are constantly turning up. Goodness knows how many badges Fattorini produced. They must run into the thousands. But when you consider that in those days every company that employed over 500 people had to have its own ARP organisation, you get some idea of how many badges there might have been.
Right.
I don't think you could ever compile a completely comprehensive catalogue. Or if you wanted to, you'd probably drive yourself mad in the process.
Yeah. And so that's really just a kind of a selection of what the most common ones, or would you say, or just...
No, I think it's fair to say it's a collection of the ones, because it was originally based around one of my collections.
Right.
That was the other problem. When we came to do this second revised edition, I had to go and talk to a lot of friends because I'd stopped collecting, but we wanted some new badges, so I had to look at them. But no, they vary. Some of them are quite scarce, some of them are quite common. The obvious things, the silver ARP lapel badge, which wasn't made by Fattorini's but made by the Royal Mint, is one of the commonest badges for the Second World War.
Yeah.
And I play a game with my wife every time we go to an antique fair, see who can be the first one to spot a silver ARP lapel badge, because you'll find them at every antique fair. The interesting point, which you've sort of touched on, is that no book like this can ever be comprehensive, because there are no records. It's okay if, for example, in the military field, for example, there are lots of catalogues. The army produced catalogues of every badge they produced, so you could go and look for every item in the catalogue because it's there and you could tick it off on the list. There's no comprehensive list of these, and in many cases the companies, for example, that issued them have long gone out of business, so nobody would know how many they ordered. What I was hoping when I spoke to Fattorini's was that they'd have a nice ledger that said we made this badge in this quantity for this company, but no, they didn't. So, and that's one of the joys of collecting anyway, finding things that you didn't expect. It's easy enough to go and say, as people do, I understand, take a book like mine and go around the fairs and tick them off as they find them. It's much harder then to come up with another 50 that you haven't seen because you've dug somewhere else or you've kept your eye on auction sites.
Sure. So I think you said every organisation over how many?
Over 500. They employed more than 500 people. They had to have their own ARP organisation.
Okay. Would that automatically have meant they would have had a badge as well, or not necessarily?
No. Well, that's one of the interesting things that comes out from the Fattorini advertising. They suggest that the badges should be awarded for two things. First of all, as a reward to the people for volunteering in their spare time to do this job, but also so that they were recognised in in an emergency by their fellow workers. So if you're working in a factory and the air raid siren went and you didn't know where the air raid shelter was, you would hopefully go to the chap who had the air raid warden's badge for the company on his jacket and say, where should I go? And he'd say, down there.
So was there also a certain amount of people wanting to show that they're doing their bit?
Oh, absolutely, which is, of course,
The title, of course.
where the title came from in the first place, yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, because obviously kind of people are well aware the First World War they had to bring out a badge because people could be given white feathers left, right
Yes,
and centre.
yeah.
And it's kind of the same applies, really.
Absolutely, yeah, and the interesting thing is that the First World War ones have never been covered. There were fewer of them because the home front wasn't quite in the same way as organised in the same way as it was in the Second World War. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of the First World War ones have crowns on them to show they were on government service. And one of the interesting things that the government said in the Second World War was you can only have a crown on them if you're actually a recognised government organisation, which is why most of these don't have crown on. Occasionally people slipped up and put crowns on them. There are examples in here of badges with crowns on which shouldn't be there, but they weren't supposed to have a crown on unless they were an official government issued badge.
You know, collectible wise, some of these badges go for quite a lot of money now, don't they?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I was amused when I was putting the book together. In many cases, I'd left the original label on, and they'd say things like £2.50.
Right.
You'll be lucky to buy leaving aside the silver ARP badges, company ARP badges will cost you between 40, 50 and as many pounds thereafter as people are concerned with. There are, for example, a category of the badges issued by the auxiliary bomb for auxiliary bomb disposal units, who were people trained to deal with unexploded bombs in factories. Now, by their nature, they were very small organisations, maybe 20 or 30 people in each factory. So if there was a badge issued, you would have had 20 or 30 badges, and the chances that they've survived
Yes, so
are pretty small.
There's few and far between.
Few and far between.
Yeah. And so when you were collecting, what I think you said you were collecting from quite an early age.
I was a collector of most things from about 10, but I became interested in the home front things in my early 20s when I had money to burn because I'd started work. So.
Right.
And in those days there were lots of markets, particularly the well-remembered one that used to operate under the arches of Charing Cross every Saturday. And in those days, again, these were disregarded, so they were being sold for £2.50, whereas a military brass cat badge would cost you a £5.
Right, and I'm assuming that sadly, this day and age, the average 10-year-old wouldn't be able to afford to collect something like this.
Well, this is the problem that collectors have discussed. The Second World War stuff has now got so expensive that it's only collected by adults, which means, of course, that there are no younger collectors coming up through the market to inherit these collections. It's been suggested that one day you'll suddenly find that you can't sell these because there's nobody with the money around or the right age to buy them.
No. We'll move on to another book, one of yours, on utility furniture.
Utility furniture.
So tell us a bit about utility furniture and the book.
Well, you're entirely to blame for this book, Ian, because you phoned me up one day and said, have you by any chance got a copy of the utility furniture catalogue? And I said, yes, I have. You're very welcome to borrow it and copy it. But how many people understand what utility furniture is about? And out of my own mouth, I shot myself in the foot, if that's not mixing a metaphor, to say that what you really needed was an explanation about utility furniture, because not many people knew what it was. I was of the generation where I grew up with it because my parents had to buy it. They were married just after the war, and in those days the only furniture you could buy brand new was utility furniture. And lots of people of my age and a few years younger have grown up with this stuff without possibly realising how interesting it is, because lots of people seem to have the impression that utility furniture is rubbish. It was made with poor materials. Quite the reverse. It was deliberately made with good materials, proper fixings, and well designed by acknowledged furniture designers, because it was felt that if the only furniture you could buy was government issued furniture, which is effectively what it is, then it should be good furniture. It wasn't going to put its name to rubbish furniture.
Right. And this actually has, you've got, I think you've got the first, Oh, here we go. A reproduction of the first
catalogue, yeah.
First catalogue with the kind of quite basic looking furniture. Which I mean, I think it's interesting because you still come across this in kind of auction houses.
Yes, yes. Still possible to pick up utility furniture, and it's very easy to discover because, of course, it's got the double cheeses. I thought that was on the cover. The utility mark, which is, I don't know if you can see it, but it appears at the top of the pages here, the two cheeses. It is stamped into all the furniture. If you turn up the chair and think it's utility furniture, somewhere underneath it you will find CC41 stamped into the wood.
So I think we ought to move on to the book you're working on at the moment.
And have been for quite some time.
Yeah. So, first of all, what is the book?
It's called Badges on Battle Dress. It's an attempt to record all the badges that were worn on the British Army's battle dress uniform between its introduction in 1939 and its disappearance in 1967. That's quite a lot of badges.
Absolutely.
And being the enthusiast that I am, I wanted to make sure that, if I use my favourite word, there was some context to the thing. So, although it covers 39 to 67, it notes in the first couple of chapters the fact that these badges actually originated in 1902, and there is a trail from 1902 through the First World War, a lot less in the 1930s, but they survived in some form between 1902 and 1939 when they started to be enormously used on British Army uniforms.
Right. And where did the 1967 date come from? Was that just at random, or?
No, what happened in 1967, they started in the early 60s to make sure that they, having got rid of national service in 1962, they created a more professional army of volunteers, and it was felt that the battle dress uniform wasn't smart enough for that new volunteer army and wasn't terribly practical.
Right.
So it disappeared in 1967 when they replaced it with what the suit they now wear called number 2 dress, which is a collar and tie and like a civilian jacket. Whereas for the field use, they introduced a combat suit, which is now visible all the time in the horrible, if I may call it that, the multi-terrain pattern camouflage, which they seem to wear all the time. But 1967 is the reason it disappeared in 1967.
Okay. So tell us something about what's the format of this book like?
It's a chronological format, and so it starts in 1902, goes on to the First World War, looks at the badges that survived with the Territorial Army during the 1930s. Then, when the whole army goes into battle dress in 1939, it just follows the development, because it didn't all happen at once. When they first went into battle dress, they said the first thing we want is to replace the brass shoulder titles that used to appear on the shoulders there with a cloth version. Partly because it's cheaper, but also because it's being cloth rather than metal, it doesn't shine. They then said, right, they went to the BEF in 1940 and they said, the trouble is we can't tell who is what. Everybody's got the same uniform. We can't tell officers from other ranks. We can't tell anything about the soldier from a distance. So they first introduced something called an arm of service strip, which was literally a coloured strip worn on the arm, which was a different colour for each of the arms. So if you were an infantryman, you wore a red one. If you were a gunner, you wore a red and blue one. If you were in the Royal Armoured Corps, you wore a red and yellow one. That was fine. That was a better way of distinguishing people. But when they got back to Britain, they then said, we need to revive the signs that were used in the First World War to indicate the divisions in which people served. And a division is a higher formation made up of lots of different arms of the services working together to fight the enemy. So they introduced what they call formation signs or divisional signs, and they eventually spread to the whole of the army. They started in September 1940. They were used primarily by the army in Britain to begin with. They spread to the desert. They were used in Italy, and by the end of the war, everybody wore them. And they are a fascinating military heraldry aspect, where they all mean something, and the stories behind some of them are quite fascinating. There's one, for example, for one of the divisions, which is actually looks like a parrot. It's actually a macaw sitting on a perch, and apparently this was adopted because when the headquarters moved into a new building in 1940, there was a macaw that sat on the perch and said "Welcome, welcome," and they thought that was an auspicious start, so they used that as the sign for the division. And they continued them after the Second World War, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And that's part of the problem, because not only are there hundreds of different designs, but they were made in different sorts or different ways. Originally they were embroidered, but the companies who made them had a lot of trouble keeping up. So they then came up with printed signs. Only one company actually made those. But there was also a period when, until they were stopped because the government said it was a waste of materials, you could buy them in woven artificial silk as well. So you can have the same badge, for example, in embroidered, silk woven and printed. And then when you get to the formations that served in the Far East, you get them made in gold wire, all sorts of very expensive and ornate.
Do you try and show some different examples?
I'm trying to show as many, yes. It's bad enough trying to show just the individual badges, but where they do exist. And what's been nice is I've been helped enormously by fellow collectors who have allowed me to go and visit them with my scanner, my portable scanner, and rummage through their collections and scan their badges. So where I haven't got the badges, because I stopped collecting those about 20 years ago, but I haven't got the badges they have. So I can say, here's the badge, here are 4 different examples, it's the same badge, but they're all made in different ways. And that will then create another tick list for people to go around the fairs and go, got that, got that. Well, that will be a heavy tick list because it's going to be 2 volumes, probably about 1,200 pages.
Wow, and is that sort of so text with photographs in between,
yes.
so showing the badges?
Yeah.
With other, is it just the badges or
no? What I've tried to do, and it's quite hard, is supplement it with photographs of the badges being worn. So I'm a regular on eBay looking for photographs of badges being worn, which are in some cases quite hard to find. For example, if you wanted an anti-aircraft command sign, which is one of the biggest commands at home, Manning as its name implies, the anti-aircraft guns, lots of photographs of those being worn. If you want to see an obscure brigade that existed for 2 years at home in 1940, the chances of you finding photographs of them are not very good. But it takes them out of the realm of a small object and showing you, my favourite word again, the context in which they were worn.
So you said it's taken you a while to write this. How long have you been writing it for?
11 years next April. I'm mad.
Yeah.
But then you probably know.
And we're nearly there.
Yes. Yes, I'm not sticking my neck out at this stage too far to say it will be available, but it should be available next year, 2018, sometime.
And it's a 2-volume book, and where will people be able to buy it?
Primarily from me, it will be listed on eBay, and I'm looking at taking adverts in the various publications. There's a very good French language publication where they do a lot of work on the British and Allied forces because, of course, they were the liberators of Europe, and there's a good readership to that. So I'm hoping to sell some to France and Belgium and Holland. And the Americans collect British badges as well. So, and I'm also connected with something called the Military Heraldry Society, which has members all over the world. So there will be a flyer in an issue of their journal at some point as well.
So it's really kind of an essential Bible for anyone that collects.
Yes, I would say that.
Yes.
But I have to admit, I've already, according to at least one website, I've already written 1 Bible. So I'm going to be doing better than certain powers in Faffa, and I've actually written 2 Bibles. Are you
going to be resting after this book comes out, or have you got another project in mind?
I've got several other projects in mind, but the first one of which is a 3rd volume of the book that I'm about to publish, showing the badges actually worn. The first 2 volumes coming out next year show the badges as badges with photographs of them being worn. But the 3rd volume will show actual examples of the uniforms on which they're worn, so you can see the whole sleeves of the badges and how they were worn. And I've started to photograph that already.
And that's being published by Walden's
Publishing, which is me, yes.
You've done a number of books that are now very sadly out of print. Is there any plans to republish any of those? Yes,
time permitting. I've already been approached by a friend who wants to update the Home Guard book, but you and I have spoken about the possibility of updating the Civil Defence book, which I'd like to do. It's now 24 years old, so it's not easy to find. And of course, I've learned a lot in the last 24 years, and production methods have changed, so it's much easier to do things. For example, a lot of the badges, which I've now found, can be scanned, whereas in the original ones I had to photograph them, cut out the photographs, stick them on a piece of paper and scan them on a colour copier. So I look forward to talking to you about republishing it in a couple of years' time, hopefully.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure, Ian. Thank you.